Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Watchmen. We're just a couple of dudes sitting on the wall. This time I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Paul Lear from ValorTube and PaulThePoke.com, and also like to take the time to introduce and welcome Checkmate from ValorTube.com.
Hey,
How are we doing today?
hey, doing well. Good evening, everybody. Blessings to all.
Well, we've had a exciting week, to say the least. I know a lot of the conflict still continues in Ukraine in regards to Russia. Here is the latest, and this is from the Institute for the Study of War, and this is the latest map of what's taking place in Ukraine as best as it can be assessed. You have any comments on this at this point?
I think the only thing that I would point out is that for having the numerical troop advantage that the Russians were supposed to have had going into this, the lines are generally speaking fairly static from where they were about 5 days ago, with the exception of what I think Putin really wants, which is in the vicinity of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. It looks like he actually is consolidating his hold and devising the land bridge that he's been looking for to Crimea. And then on top of that, we had the Mariupol Children's Hospital incident this past week, and I've got some pretty strong feelings about that, which I've put up on Fighting Checkmates on ValorTube. But what I would say is that region of Ukraine from the Crimean Peninsula up to the Donbass region, that area that's becoming Putin's land bridge, generally speaking, the control of that area from a business standpoint and from a military standpoint comes back to the personality of one Ihor Kolomoisky. The Ukrainian military doesn't look like it was down there in real appreciable force, and it was left to the Azov battalion or Azov regiment, some people translate it. So what I would do, and I wrote this up in Fighting Checkmates, what I would do is caution people about Putin when he said that they were going in there to denazify. He actually was not kidding. These are neo-Nazis. There's some reporting out there that I have yet to fully substantiate that they have been trained in small unit tactics by the CIA, and they're the ones that locked down Mariupol with nobody getting in, nobody getting out, basically holding the city as hostage. And it is them who the Russians have been fighting down in that area. Other than that, nothing really, no other great pieces of wisdom to impart on Ukraine.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get into some of the news that has taken place, I would say behind the scenes, just because this conflict has kind of taken a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And the emphasis is going to be in and around Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 continues to dominate the news, and specifically, I'm going to start out just with the idea, eventually at some point when this starts to happen, and what we believe will be Russia and friends moving south towards the Middle East. Take a look at verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. Now we're going to speak more about Sheba and Dedan later in this discussion, but the idea here is that Israel is isolated. Nobody's going to come to Israel's defense, and so you're going to have what effectively would be the Saudis and merchants of Tarshish, loosely Europe, and all of its leaders. They're just going to stand back. They're not going to do anything. They're going to protest, but they're not going to intervene. And the idea is that Israel will become isolated. Nobody will come to their defense in the whole world. And so we are seeing that now, and I always have been kind of amazed. It's like, well, how will we get to a point where one country, let alone Israel, nobody will come to their defense? So in effect, I mean, we're seeing the same thing happen in Ukraine. Nobody's really coming to the defense of the Ukrainians other than supplying some arms and some supplies, but nobody's really jumping in there to help these folks out. And the same thing's going to happen again. I mean, so in that sense, we are there with Ukraine, and the same thing will happen in the future with the nation of Israel, which leads us to this article from the Times of Israel, President Zelensky of Ukraine suggests Jerusalem host negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And this one it's like, my Lord, if you're Israel, why in the world would you want to stick your nose in this? And again, the prime minister of Israel is an Orthodox Jew. He has to have read Ezekiel 38 and 39. And he has to understand at some point, Russia is going to come knocking along with some allies from the north. And that's where I'll turn this over to you and get your insights on this issue with wanting to hold peace negotiations in Jerusalem between these two.
When you consider the ego of the two leaders involved here being Zelensky and Putin, one has to consider that this is just further chumming up the ocean in terms of the animosity between Putin and the Israelis. Because Putin, part of his reason for being in a place like Syria, where we know he has a serious invested interest, which you and I have documented, and we've even documented it together in these videos, is a kind of a security guarantee to the Assad regime, and yet the Israelis are flying over Damascus and bombing it every so often, ensuring their own interests. And there's some real consternation that has developed between the Russians and the Israelis. It's already emerging. And so you look at something like this, and you can't help but think, was this one of those hand of God moments where, we're seeing the sauce being applied to the goose in anticipation of further antagonism, that the Israelis have to now become involved in this, even though I will give credit to the Bennett government. They really tried to be as non-committal as they could for having as many commercial and diaspora interests engaged in Ukraine as they do.
And speaking of non-committal, I think that's the perfect word, because then we also have this. So I guess this was from today. I guess actually it was from the Times of Israel. Speaking of non-committal, the United States is now upset effectively with Israel for being non-committal in this, and they're putting pressure on Israel to join Western sanctions on Russia.
That's right. This is really speaking out of both sides of our mouths as the United States. I mean, first of all, Toria Nuland, who is pictured there, is somebody who I have had the happenstance to have interacted with on a professional level. And for her to make such a statement like this, it's fairly typical of her pedigree, which is the Foreign Service, which is they'll take the high road every chance that they get it. Even though it is undeserved, because we have for a long time had a chance to tell the Israelis, why are you hosting some of these Russian oligarchs? Why do you extend them citizenship? And it's really more the Ukrainian oligarchs who have their money going into Israel. So you've got Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. A few of them have dual citizenship. And the United States is now lecturing Israel not to be a haven for money, when there are far worse offenders of who might be a haven for their money, such as Greece and Cyprus, and even, frankly, the United Kingdom, which at least makes a good show of policing up the oligarchs.
Yeah, everybody's on this big hunt right now for chasing down yachts and taking yachts for ransom, essentially. All these Russian yachts around the planet. It's like, hey, we got another one over in this part of the world. So with the backdrop of all of this, and again, we're gonna go back to Ezekiel 38, and you look at the countries involved. Chief Prince of Meshech, Tubal, that's modern day Turkey, Togarmah, Beth Togarmah, down in verse 6, Gomer. These are ancient names for what is modern day Turkey, the countries between the seas and the Balkans. That'd be Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, all those, Chechnya is in that area. All of these ancient names are covering the land that is this part of the world, leads to these modern day countries. And then so here we have President Recep Erdogan of Turkey has now reached out to the president of Israel, President Herzog, which is different than the Prime Minister Bennett. The Israeli president kind of serves as a like a father figure of the country, an ambassador sort of role. And he was welcomed to Turkey this past week on the 9th. And effectively, my simple approach to this has been, well, Erdogan's desperate for cash, and he wants Israeli gas to run through Turkey to get his cut of it. But again, it speaks to the prophetic nature of Ezekiel 38, in that Turkey's going to play a role in this, and how all this gets consolidated between Turkey and Russia. And we're going to talk about these two, which will lead to Iran, which all the players are in the news this week. It's just fascinating. So what kind of insights and thoughts do you have on this particular issue?
Well, this is certainly Erdogan attempting to mend fences with the Israelis. Ever since, I would say, about 2006, it had been clear that it was on the downhill slide. I would argue that there was indications in the very early going that Erdogan was going to be a problem from the moment he assumed power. But it's been since 2006 that things have really been on a downhill slide. And Turkey's military adventurism between Libya and Armenia, as well as Syria, really hasn't gotten it very much. And a lot of that goes to many things, not least of which is his purging of the military of its secular traditions in favor of promoting much more closer adherence to the People's Justice and Development Party, which is Erdogan's political party, with its Islamic revivalist theme. And in that way, you were no longer promoting the most qualified, most capable officers. You were giving them the political reliability test, kind of like the slope our military has been going down for the past 10 years. And so it's really shown in the way that they deploy and they conduct military action. Troops are less reliable, chain of command is less effective, even though they have great equipment in large numbers. So the reach for peace is kind of a natural pivot.
Yeah, and that speaks to the nature of this group of coming together between Russia and Turkey. They have yet to consolidate power, if you will, or consolidate. Hey, we're of one mind. We need to go against Israel. But all of these countries, and of course the big one that's been out there is the discussion in and around Ezekiel 38 and 5. When you look who else is involved, Persia. Well, that one's pretty straightforward. Ancient Persia is modern day Iran, and they have been all over the news the last week in regards to the Iranian nuclear deal. And so you have representatives, I believe it was Mikhail Ulyanov from Russia, who was assisting with the negotiations. He's involved in the negotiations for the Iranian nuclear deal with the West. And then we have these types of things start to emerge in the news over the past week.
That's right. This little stinker got released on Monday, I believe, Monday afternoon. And concurrent with its release, the Iranian chief negotiator up and got on a plane from Vienna and flew off to Tehran for quote-unquote consultations. I am not sure if this really had a direct impact, because correlation and causation are frequently two different things. But I found it interesting that the day this came out, and what this says to me in reading it is that there are people in the U.S. bureaucracy who really do mean to do well by the United States. And there's probably a lot of frustration that they did catch somebody in the act who was acting in the name of the Iranian government, be it the Iranian Revolutionary Guards or the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, or even somebody who was just out there as a lone wolf with a wink and a nod, that they probably have caught some people who were up to some dangerous mischief. Whether or not Bolton was the actual target, or Pompeo, or Brian Hook, those are the names that are frequently mentioned in the press in revenge for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was a lawful combatant, incidentally. But this comes out, and then the chief negotiator leaves Vienna and heads to Tehran, and was there for about a full day. He was there for, I think, about 2 days in terms of the numbers of hours, and then he eventually came back.
You better check with the Ayatollah. And as you were saying, he goes to Tehran, and then now he's back on the plane and he heads back to Vienna. And I'll let you speak to this fella.
Yeah, he ended up coming back. It was a very short turnaround. Again, he was only in Tehran for a full day. He got there one day, was there for a day, and then left the next day. Considering those flights usually go out, I think around 3 o'clock in the morning. I guess he had 2 full days there. Those flights go out that early in the morning because the Iranians like really crank up the landing fees after 6 a.m. So European airlines are like, we're not paying that kind of money to land in Tehran. So they all go out at 3 o'clock in the morning. But anyhow, he ended up coming back. He went immediately into meetings with the European Union, and what it seems the collective impasse is pointing now to. The Iranians from home began sniping that it was the United States that was holding this up, but the international consensus seems to be falling around the Russians, and that this issue of attempting to assassinate Ambassador Bolton was just a blip that has been disregarded and swallowed up in the news cycle.
Okay, and then and now things are on a pause, if you will. As I understand it, would you reflect that as being accurate at this point?
I think that's probably the most responsible phrase. I mean, all of these talks are irresponsible, but there are people who say more outrageous things than others. I mean, some have said the talks are dead, and with all this time, effort, and over compromise by the United States, I would call it acquiescence. You've got nearly all of the parties to this, except it would seem the Russians, really can't afford for this deal not to work out. But the Russians, as you and I talked about, I think 2 editions ago of this video series, they have a pretty sweet deal for exporting Iranian energy, and it's going to go over their infrastructure. So it's in effect theirs once they take delivery of it. They're deeply concerned about those very stores of energy being wrapped up in U.S. sanctions. So you can understand where the Russians are coming from, that on the one hand, they're supposed to deliver in these talks, and on the other, we're sanctioning. I would argue, some would say carefully, not to avoid a real fight with them. I would say we're sanctioning carelessly at this point, and they want to ensure against that. All the while, the rest of the Middle East region is watching the United States and saying the Americans have truly gone nuts.
And if I remember that correctly, that's in reference to, I believe it was like a 25-year treaty the Russians and the Persians have in regards to an oil field or a natural gas field in the middle of the Caspian Sea that they were going to process on behalf of the Iranians, correct?
That's right. The Iranians get a cut, but the Russians do the drilling, lifting, and the moving. So for all intents and purposes, the Russians just pay a really hefty fee for thank you for letting us abstract the energy that's in your territory.
And it makes me wonder, because I was always of the opinion they were going to wait for Israel to have the infrastructure in place. Well, they clearly have no problem with just going and taking that at some point, out in the Mediterranean. Utilize the same principles they're using here with the Iranians. They'll just do the same thing in the Med. I mean, that just stands to reason.
I think that would be the play if they could have anything they wanted. I think that would be the play. Is that let the Israelis fall to their knees and then dictate terms to them. I think God might have something to say about that, but
he's going to. He will have something to say. And effectively, this is kind of where we are now with this situation, is stumble over unresolved Russian demands because they want to make sure they get their cut.
That's right. And I had been telling the Fighting Checkmates readership and viewership, when I occasionally have the industry to make a video, that this time last week I was saying Iran deal by Monday, and it looked certain. Just about everybody who I talked to, from the Israelis to former colleagues at the State Department, they were all saying, yeah, it looks like it's a done deal. And once again, the hand of God intervenes, and here we go.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's the one thing that I continue to be fascinated in watching these things happen. There are some things that appear to be very certain, and they don't happen. And then there are times you wake up in the morning, something's happened, and you're like, where did that come from? I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
the twists and the turns with this stuff. Now we know where it ends and how it goes, but how we get there and the I mean, and I suppose some of that's part is a testament of faith. Do you believe God and what God says the outcome's going to be? Because it's not going to be a straightforward, smooth ride to get there. And I think that speaks to, we're going to next go to the Saudis, and we talked about this initially, and Scripture tells us Sheba and Dedan, those are ancient names for what is modern day Saudi Arabia. They're going to stand around. They're going to protest when Russia comes into the Middle East and wants to make a move on Israel. Russian friends, and they're going to protest, but they're not going to do anything. They realize what the play is. They realize it's for economic purposes. And then, you can't help if you're the Saudis watching all this go down. I mean, they're refusing to take calls from the United States and Biden, and they confirm holding companies to develop nuclear facilities, atomic industry. So, I mean, this is kind of an outflow of, this position. We're trending toward this position that Scripture says where they're going to be a bystander on behalf of, they're not going to stand up and go to bat for Israel other than just kind of protest. And I think, as we talked about earlier, I think we're kind of trending in that direction.
Yeah, this is the Saudis. This one and the next one are signs that they're starting to believe once again that you can't count on the United States. We're going to have to go it alone. We got to stand up on our own 2 feet the way we always have, as good, cruel, harsh Bedouins. And the development of a nuclear program, they already have a relationship with Pakistan that kind of brings Pakistan, folds the nuclear deterrent of Pakistan into Saudi Arabia's orbit. In other words, if anybody were to go for the jugular with Saudi Arabia, that they could draw on the Pakistani nuclear deterrent. What the state of that is, I'm not sure. There were some overtures that I think I spoke about on one of the Fighting Checkmates videos about 5 months ago about this very issue. But they're showing that they need to go it their own way. So when you see something like this, your first reaction should be the Iranian nuclear negotiations. That should instantly be your first reaction, because the Saudis, they're not an international pariah to the tenor that the Iranians are, and that they can pay for first-class research facilities, first-class power facilities, and in terms of having a covert, off-the-books nuclear capability for weaponry, they kind of already have that with respect to their relationship with Pakistan. So they've already got kind of a good off-the-books nuclear program mapped out. And what this returns us to, that you and I talked about, I believe, 2 videos ago, is the difference between Sunnis and Shiites. Sunnis, being in Saudi Arabia, are the guardians of the 2 holy places, Mecca and Medina, and therefore within Sunni Islam, they're considered the standard bearers for all of Sunni Islam. And of course, Sunni is, the root word is sunnah, which is brotherhood. It goes back to the succession of the second caliph in charge of the pan-Islamic caliphate, that it should go to a blood relative of the caliph in terms of rulership. Whereas in Iran, under Shiism, what they have is what's called the Waliyat al-Faqih, which is rule of the Islamic jurist, that it should go to learned Quranic scholars who decide what the law is, as opposed to a monarchy like what you have in Saudi Arabia. So this is where that divide comes back into play, because now it looks like the Iranians, as the Shiites and the Waliyat al-Faqih, they're getting a green light for the bomb. No matter what anybody says, no matter what diplomatic nicety gets put on it, it's going to be a Shiite bomb. And the Saudis, as the standard bearers for Sunni Islam, have to show that they're competing and they're not leaving the store unattended. And so that, and this next story that I wanted to point out, it all goes to show what U.S. absenteeism gets you, as well as acquiescence at the nuclear talks.
And I think you make a great point there too about how, the difference in how they apply governance, if you will. And that's Iran. Those guys, like the president, Raisi, he is a legal scholar of the Quran, and he is seen as one of the best and the brightest. I mean, he's a brutal frankly, killer, and has executed arguably a war criminal, as many would put it. But that guy is a legal scholar of the Quran and the interpretation of the Quran versus, the Saudis. We're just passing this down the family line. Next up, and it speaks. I think that's an excellent analysis of breaking it down between the Sunni Shia divide, and that's what we're seeing at play. And then again, the outflow of that from the Saudi standpoint is this article from CNN.
That's right. What drew my attention to this piece is that usually when the Saudis, in recent years, when they've executed people, they've kept it on the down low because there's no way we can really stop them from doing it. It's their country, it's their system of laws. But on top of that, many of these summary executions that take place in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there are, I believe it's 7 tribes within Saudi Arabia. It's a tribal confederation. And within these tribes, you have infighting from time to time that is usually started sometimes over petty things, but they go up to the various tribal sheikhs, if you will, who have a relationship between one another, and there are certain ways of settling scores. Sometimes it's with money, sometimes it's with goods, sometimes it's with somebody else's life if the transgression is bad enough. And so Saudi law seeks to accommodate the balancing of those tribes in the interests of the overall kingdom. And so many of these people who are being executed, and this story being this public, it's really just them keeping their own internal house straight. Some of them probably are criminals who maybe even by U.S. standards deserve to be executed. It's all opaque to us, and that's the Saudi justice system. But the mere fact that they are willing to advertise that they did this, not really advertising, but at least let it be known that they're doing this, and they don't care what the United States says. There's already the rumor out there they're turning down phone calls from Joe Biden. The United States really is an absentee landlord in the Middle East, with the exception of the ambassadors to the region and the Central Command commander. The United States is really an absentee landlord there. We're being seen to desert our one ally, Israel, which, believe it or not, that is how the Arabs gauge how strong we are in the region, is how closely do we stick by Israel. So even though they hate the decisions we make when we do that, they at least respect it. And then on top of that, we're acquiescing in the nuclear talks. They are showing their own house within that they're still strong, they're still in charge, they can still manage their own affairs, and they're showing the rest of the world that they are who they are, and they make no apologies for it.
And that's kind of has been the theme of the last few years as the United States steps away from the Middle East. History is just full of this. When something is removed, a vacuum is created, something is going to take its place. And that something has been clearly Russia. Or, as I've put it a lot of times on my blog, where the United States steps out, prophecy is stepping in. So here we go again, Ezekiel 38, verse 5. And we look at the participants with Russia, Persia, Kush, and Put. Ancient Put is modern day Libya. And Russia has been supporting various political players to try to get their man in place. They want, their puppet in place to run things according to what the Russians want in Libya. Again, Libya is the largest producer of oil and gas in Africa, so they have a business stake there. And I think elections were supposed to take place, December 24th of 2021. Those were delayed. And so now we have a new incoming prime minister. And he initially was supportive, or Russia welcomed his government. And then now he's protesting what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
I think that this goes back to what we discussed last time about Ukraine and parts of Russia being the breadbasket of Europe. That a lot of the stuff that's supposed to leave the ports on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, that goes to North Africa and the Middle East primarily. And we could be, if the farmers are not in the fields in the next 6 or so weeks, getting ready for the next, undertaking the next planting season, or there's some jam up in the ports, we've got a real problem in terms of the social unrest that could overtake North Africa.
Well, and it's it's twofold in that sense too. So there are the crops that are in the field now. If they continue to fight, they won't be able to harvest those crops. They continue to fight, they won't be able to plant the next crops. So we're on the verge. We're in a window of time, probably in the next, long term, 5-6 months, where we could be on the verge of losing two seasons of crops over fighting between Russia and Ukraine. And then, again, the whole, North Africa is at risk. You look at these countries across here, from Algeria to Libya to Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, all of this area is at risk. They are very reliant on wheat coming out of this area of the world north of the Black Sea where all the fighting's taking place. So these politicians, I mean, if you're a newly elected politician or you're a newly selected politician put in power, you want to make darn sure your population is fed so you are not at risk of being thrown out of office violently. And I think that drives a lot of this stuff with these folks.
And the other thing about this particular article in Al Monitor is that it actually visits a whole gamut of issues between Libya and Moscow. And I think it does so. It's an opinion piece. I think it does so fairly responsibly in terms of the dilemmas that the new Libyan leadership is going to have to face after the Russians really championed the rise of Libya forming a government. And however much or as little as they've had their hand in it, generally speaking, the key person to watch in Libyan politics for what the Russian mood is the warlord Haftar. Because he's the one who's thick with the Russians. And both he and the Russians really seem to know how to handle each other. They don't trust each other, they don't love each other, but they know how they can do business with each other. And so if you want to see what the Russian mood is, generally it's going to be borne out. And he's a big man on campus in Libyan politics in terms of forming a government. If he doesn't approve of something, it won't get done.
And he's made trips, golly, he's been making trips back and forth to Moscow the last few years. And they put that out in their press and their coverage, both on the Libyan end and on the Russian end, too. So,
that's right. That's right.
And we're going to close with this this incident that took place on the 10th. So this was a couple of days ago. This is from Intel Sky. Pakistan says Indian supersonic missile that entered its territory crashed in Mayan Chanu. And I am full speculation on my point. I am fascinated with India's future role and how all of this is going to go down. What kind of insights, thoughts do you have in regards to India with this type of incident moving forward?
When I was at the State Department, we attempted to get the Indians and the Pakistanis as a confidence-building measure between the two countries to at least establish a hotline between the two capitals, between Islamabad and New Delhi. And as far as I know, they did it. And these kinds of cross-border incursions, this one was a bit more dramatic than most because it was a missile. It wasn't just a stray pilot who ended up off course. These kinds of things do happen, and ever since they have developed sort of political echelon to political echelon open communications, the chances that something like this would get out of kilter really quickly have really diminished considerably. Part of that is the influence of China. China is very active in Pakistan, with Pakistan as a client state, and China knows that that they face in the mountains of the Himalaya mountains. They're facing a good portion of the Indian Army themselves. China has its appetites elsewhere, being Taiwan, of course, but also the Chinese have an internal stability problem. So it would really fall for the time being for the Chinese to go to the Pakistanis and say, look, see this for what it is. It's an error. Probably remind the Pakistanis that they too have done things like this in the past. And fun fact, this past week also a stray Russian cruise missile that was supposed to hit Ukraine ended up landing in Croatia. So its terminal guidance didn't kick in, and the thing just kept on flying, went right over its target and on in almost to the Adriatic Sea.
Well, and I think this also speaks to how all of this is interconnected. Because you'd mentioned earlier with the Saudis, how have a loose relationship with the Pakistanis, and then that way that keeps Iran flanked on both the southwest and the southeast. So I mean, you have all these kind of loose agreements, and you wonder, well, how could something that happens in Pakistan have anything to do with what happens with Israel? Well, you can see that, looking at this map and all these coalitions of nations and kind of loose agreements between these different nations to protect each other from, potential nuclear Iran. Not a reach. And this is just pure conjecture from my standpoint. For the life of me, we've talked about this quite a bit and how we have not seen the emergence of a 10-nation federation in all of this yet is just beyond me. And I know Daniel's 10 toes of iron and clay have yet to emerge on the scene, but I think India is a fascinating piece of that potential puzzle. And the West is suffering from a leadership vacuum, and I've seen buzzings about the D10, so that would be the G7, and then the three likely candidates that keep coming up would be the South Koreans, and the Australians, and the Indians. And then you have, the G7 already comprises of Japan, the United States, England, Germany, France, and Italy. So something worth watching. I don't know what kind of thoughts you have on that issue, but that's something that India is very fascinating to me. I don't know what your take on that is.
In terms of a D10, I guess it remains to materialize. But what I would say about the Indians is that they're in a difficult situation with respect to Ukraine and Russia, because they too get a lot of their wheat from Ukraine, and they also have a deep commercial relationship with Ukraine. Where Russia is concerned, that's where they get most of their military hardware, is either from Russia or on license. Even though the United States has concluded an agreement to manufacture a new breed of fighters, which is an adaptation of the F-16, as well as C-130 cargo planes. It'll really be a good leap for the Indian military, but that's still in the nascent stage. So the Indians, they really are walking between the raindrops in terms of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and they've been rather non-committal altogether on the whole thing. And on top of all of that, they do have a non-trivial potential flashpoint with the Chinese. That could turn into one of the most brutal wars anybody's seen in modern times if it were to go hot. Right along the border there in the mountains.
Well, they've already had some skirmishes, and I guess they, in the spirit of keeping to some of these treaties, they put down their rifles and they went after each other with knives and hatchets.
Yeah.
In certain parts of this, and I just brutal, and they don't like each other. And I know just some of the stuff. I look at a lot of things from standpoint of Revelation 9 in China, and the destruction is going to come from them. They are all kinds of construction out here in the western end of China. What many people think to be missile silos for nuclear arsenal. So definitely worth watching. So that kind of closes up where we are for the week ending March 12th. You have any closing thoughts you want to share?
Nothing, no great afflatus on my end.
Okay. Well, I'm sure the news will not disappoint, and there'll be plenty to talk about again next week. It just continues to increase from an information standpoint, and for one person to try to keep up with it is craziness. I know I spoke with my cousin a lot in the past, and we were talking about, you see one item, one big ticket news item a week or a month, and we thought it was a big deal. And I mean, we're just cherry picking the stories that we find are the lowest hanging fruit on this thing at this point. And we are trending hard toward a global situation, and that happens to line up with what a lot of the prophets have to say is going to happen as related information to them by the Lord himself. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to stop and listen. Appreciate it. Welcome, or thank you once again from a couple of dudes sitting on the wall, the Watchmen. Thanks.